Every great story begins with peace before the storm, and this farmer's life was no different. Before neighbors tried to block his only road, before fences and disputes changed everything, he lived a life of quiet routine, honest labor, and deep connection to the land. In this chapter, we see the farmer's world as it was before conflict, a world of soil, sweat, and simplicity, with subtle signs that trouble might not be far away. The mornings on the farm began before the sun itself appeared, when the sky was still a canvas of gray and faint blue. The rooster's crow cut through the silence, echoing across the acres of land that stretched far beyond the eye could comfortably follow. The farmer, a man in his mid-40s, would rise with the discipline of someone who had long accepted that life did not wait for late risers. His boots were always by the door, caked with dried mud from the day before, ready to walk the soil again. The smell of strong black coffee filled the kitchen, mingling with the scent of the wood-burning stove. For him, coffee was not luxury, it was fuel, and each sip was a reminder of the work awaiting outside. His land was more than a property. It was a living thing that demanded care, and in return offered him sustenance and dignity. He knew each stretch of field, each bend of the dirt road, each tree that shaded his cattle on scorching summer days. The farm had been in his family for 2 generations, passed down by a father who believed in the power of hard work and a mother who taught resilience in silence. The farmer often thought of them during his morning walks, when the mist still hovered low and the dew clung stubbornly to the blades of grass. This land was their legacy, and he treated it with the respect one would give to sacred ground. The road that led from his farmhouse to the nearby town was a narrow strip of dirt and gravel. To outsiders, it was nothing more than a back road, but to him, it was a lifeline. It was a path through which supplies came in and produce went out, the road that connected him to markets, neighbors, and the wider world beyond. Without it, he was landlocked, trapped within his own fences. Each time his truck rolled over its uneven surface, each time he heard the crunch of gravel beneath his tires, he felt a sense of reassurance. That road meant access, freedom, and possibility. He never thought it could be taken away, never imagined that one day it would be the cause of his greatest battle. The farmer's days were long, but they were his own. He tended cattle in the mornings, checked irrigation lines, and mended fences that storms often tore down. His hands, thick and calloused, bore the evidence of years of labor. Yet, despite the relentless work, he carried no bitterness. His satisfaction came not from ease but from results. The sight of a healthy calf standing steady for the first time, or rows of corn swaying tall in the wind. This was the rhythm of his life. Work, rest, repeat. Some would call it monotonous, but he called it purpose. The community around him was small, the kind where people knew each other's names, birthdays, and business. The neighbors, though not overly close, were part of the landscape of his daily life. He waved at them on the road, traded pleasantries at the feed store, and occasionally lent a hand when weather or misfortune struck. Most days, they coexisted peacefully, each minding their own responsibilities. Yet beneath the politeness, the farmer sometimes sensed tension, a stiffness in greetings, a reluctance to engage too warmly. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't warmth either. There was one neighbor in particular, a man who owned the adjoining property, who always seemed watchful. Their conversations were courteous, but laced with unspoken competition, as though both silently measured the other's success. The farmer never pressed too deeply into those feelings. Life on the land was demanding enough without adding unnecessary disputes. He believed in live and let live, and most days that philosophy served him well. Still, there were moments when he wondered how long such fragile balance could last. In the evenings, after a full day's work, he would sit on the porch with a worn-out hat shading his face, watching the sun disappear behind the fields. The sky would shift from golden orange to deep crimson, and then finally into the cool blues of night. He often found comfort in these sunsets, as though they were a daily reminder that no matter the troubles of the world, nature still kept its rhythm. His dog would lie faithfully by his feet, ears twitching at the sounds of crickets and the rustle of unseen creatures in the grass. The farmer's life was not luxurious, but it was honest, and honesty was wealth in itself. He owned little compared to city folks, but he was rich in something else: independence. He didn't answer to a boss or a clock. His time was his own, and though his body often ached from the work, his spirit thrived on the freedom. That freedom, however, hinged on one fragile truth: the land and the road that connected it. Without either, his independence would crumble. Though he didn't know it then, small signs of trouble were already creeping into his routine. A neighbor who once waved without hesitation now gave only a curt nod. A casual comment about property lines carried a sharper tone than before. Even the road, his precious road, seemed to attract more glances, as though others had begun to see its value differently. The farmer noticed these things, but brushed them aside. He was too focused on his work to dwell on speculation. But the land has a way of whispering truths before they erupt into storms. That summer, the crops grew slower than usual, and rains were scarce. Tension in the community seemed to mirror the weather, dry, brittle, and ready to spark. The farmer worked harder than ever, pouring energy into keeping his field alive, but each day felt heavier. It wasn't just the heat. It was a feeling that something unseen was shifting, something that would soon demand his full attention. As the chapter of his quiet life closed, the farmer could not have guessed how much his world was about to change. For now, his days remained simple: sunrises, labor, and sunsets. But beneath that simplicity was an unspoken truth. His freedom rested on ground that others had begun to covet, and his lifeline, that narrow gravel road, was slowly becoming the center of a conflict that would test his patience, his intelligence, and his willpower like never before. The summer heat had settled over the land like a heavy blanket, making every task feel twice as difficult. The farmer was used to hard work under the sun, but what weighed on him more than the weather was a shift in his neighbor's behavior. The greetings that once carried a smile had become tight-lipped nods, and conversations that used to last a few minutes now ended after a curt exchange. He told himself it was nothing, just the natural ups and downs of neighborly interactions. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that something was brewing beneath the surface. The first sign of trouble came one morning when he drove his truck down the gravel road toward town. A neighbor stood by the fence line, arms crossed, watching him with a look that was more scrutiny than greeting. The farmer slowed and tipped his hat politely, but instead of waving, the man muttered something under his breath. Though he couldn't hear the words clearly, the tone was unmistakable disapproval. For the rest of the drive, the farmer replayed the moment in his mind, trying to understand what could have caused it. Had he offended someone unknowingly? Was there some misunderstanding in town he hadn't heard about? The answer came a week later, when another neighbor approached him directly. It happened at the feed store, of all places, where people often exchange casual talk about weather, cattle prices, and planting conditions. The neighbor, a woman from down the road, leaned closer after their small talk and said, "You know, some folks aren't too happy about how much you use that road. They say it runs too close to their property and stirs up dust." Her words were softened with an apologetic tone, but the message was sharp. The farmer felt a pang of disbelief. That road had been in use for decades, long before property lines shifted hands. It wasn't just a path for him. It was the access point for his farm, as essential as water or electricity. He thanked her for telling him and walked away with a heavy mind. That evening, sitting on his porch, he thought through the matter. If it was just dust, he could fix it. He could spray water on the road during dry spells, maybe even spread more gravel to keep it firm. He believed problems could be solved with goodwill and practical solutions. After all, they were neighbors. They lived side by side, and in a small community, cooperation was survival. The next morning, he visited the neighbor who had glared at him days before. With calmness in his voice, he explained that he was willing to address concerns. "I don't want to make life harder for anyone," he said. "If the dust bothers you, I'll take steps to keep it down." But the neighbor's response was colder than expected. "It's not just dust," the man said flatly. "It's the principle. That road shouldn't even be used the way you're using it. You're cutting too close to my land." The farmer stood silent for a moment, measuring his words carefully. He knew the road's history, knew that it had been the designated route for as long as anyone could remember. He could almost hear his father's voice telling him to stay patient, not to meet anger with anger. So he chose restraint. "I hear you," he finally said. "Let's see if we can work something out." But deep down, he sensed this wasn't about dust or boundaries. It was about control. Word spread quickly, as it often does in rural communities. Within weeks, it seemed everyone had an opinion about the road dispute. Some sided with the farmer, recalling how long the path had been used without complaint. Others muttered that maybe it was time for new arrangements, that property lines should be respected more strictly. The farmer found himself the center of whispered conversations at the diner, the feed store, and even Sunday gatherings. Where once he had been simply the farmer down the road, he was now a symbol of controversy. The pressure began to mount when more neighbors voiced irritation. One accused him of driving too often, claiming the constant traffic disrupted their peace. Another suggested that he should find an alternate path, even though none realistically existed. Each complaint felt less like a grievance and more like a coordinated push, as though they had quietly banded together against him. He tried not to take it personally, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of their disapproval. At home, the farmer wrestled with his frustration. He spoke aloud sometimes while fixing tools or tending cattle, questioning why people couldn't simply talk things through. "I've lived here all these years, and suddenly the road is a problem," he muttered to himself one evening. His dog, lying at his feet, lifted its head as if sensing his unrest. He rubbed its ears absent-mindedly, wondering when neighborliness had been replaced by hostility. Despite his efforts to keep the peace, the situation escalated. One morning, he discovered a freshly posted sign near the road that read, "Private property, do not trespass." The words were bold and unwelcoming, nailed into a wooden post that leaned defiantly toward his path. Though the sign didn't block him physically, its message was clear. The neighbors were laying claim, and they wanted him gone from that road. The farmer took a deep breath and tried to steady his anger. He had choices now. He could fight openly, confront them with equal hostility, or he could attempt another round of diplomacy. Choosing the latter, he approached the neighbor once again. "That road is my only access," he explained patiently. "If you have issues, let's involve the county, make it official. I don't want to trespass, but I can't abandon the only route to my farm." The neighbor's reply was cold, dismissive. "County or no county, we'll see about that." Those words stuck with the farmer long after the conversation ended. It was no longer about dust or boundaries. This was a battle brewing, one that might not end with handshakes or shared coffee on a porch. It was becoming something deeper, something rooted in resentment and pride. As weeks passed, the farmer began to notice little acts of hostility. A section of the road seemed deliberately torn up one morning, making his drive bumpier and slower. Another time, he found branches and debris scattered across it, too perfectly placed to be natural. Each time, he cleared the path and kept moving, refusing to let frustration dictate his actions. But the message was loud and clear. The neighbors wanted him off that road, and they were willing to make his life harder until he gave in. The unease in town grew alongside the dispute. People who once greeted him warmly now kept their distance, not wanting to be pulled into the feud. A friend quietly advised him, "Be careful. This isn't just a neighborly spat anymore. Folks are choosing sides." The farmer nodded, already aware of the shift. He felt isolated, not just on his farm, but in the very community he had long called home. At night, sleep came slowly. He would lie awake listening to the creak of the house, the distant call of night birds and the hum of cicadas, his mind turning over the problem like a stone he couldn't put down. He wondered what his father would have done in his place. He imagined his mother's voice reminding him that dignity was not in loud fights, but in quiet strength. Yet even with those memories, he could not escape the growing truth. This was no small matter. The neighbors were not backing down, and neither could he. The road dispute had started as a murmur of irritation, but it was growing into a storm. The farmer, once content with his quiet life, now stood at the edge of conflict. What had begun as dust complaints and property lines was turning into something larger, something that would test not just his patience, but his very claim to freedom. And though he didn't know it yet, the fight for that narrow strip of gravel would soon force him into choices that would change his life forever. The farmer woke one morning to sound of silence that felt heavier than usual. Normally, the day began with the distant rumble of truck on the road, the faint hum of life stirring in the neighboring farms, or at the very least, the crunch of gravel under his own boots as he prepared for work. But this morning was different. It was too still, too quiet, as though the air itself was holding back a warning. He poured his coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and glanced toward the road. What he saw made his chest tighten. Across the path that led from his land to the outside world, a fence had been erected. It wasn't a flimsy barrier or a temporary obstacle. It was deliberate, heavy, and undeniable. Wooden posts had been driven deep into ground, strung tightly with wire, blocking every inch of the road. Attached to the fence were signs painted in bold red letters. Private property, no access. The words glared back at him, not just as a restriction, but as an insult. His lifeline had been cut, and with it his independence. For a moment, he simply stood frozen. Disbelief clouded his mind. He had known tensions were rising, had sensed hostility in every sideways glance and muttered word. But even so, this act felt unthinkable. They had crossed from petty grievances into outright aggression. His heart pounded as he set his coffee down on the porch rail, walked down the steps, and made his way toward the fence. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of generations pressed on his shoulders. Standing before the blockade, he gripped the rough wooden posts with his callous hands. The fence was sturdy, carefully placed, and clearly meant to last. Whoever built it had worked fast, perhaps overnight, while he slept unaware. He stared at the road beyond, the familiar stretch of gravel now cut off, and for the first time in years, he felt trapped on his own land. The freedom he had always taken for granted seemed to vanish in that instant, replaced by a cage built not of steel, but of arrogance and spite. The farmer's first instinct was to tear it down, to grab his tools and dismantle the barrier plank by plank until his road was clear again. But something held him back. Reason, or perhaps the echo of his father's voice reminding him that rashness rarely wins battles. He knew if he tore it down now, the conflict would explode into something even uglier. He needed to think, to understand the scope of what he was truly up against. When he drove into town later that day by taking the long, rough trail through the back pasture, a route that was slow, muddy, and never meant for daily use, he found the whispers already spreading. People looked at him differently, their eyes filled with curiosity and caution. Some approached with sympathy, shaking their heads and saying it wasn't right. Others stayed silent, unwilling to speak openly against the neighbors who had caused the blockade. Fear hung in the air like smoke, making it clear that while some might pity him, few were willing to stand beside him. One old man at the diner leaned closer over his coffee and whispered, "They've gone too far this time. That road's been used longer than I can remember. Blocking it like that, it ain't just mean, it's unlawful." The farmer nodded but said nothing. He had no appetite for gossip. What he needed was action, but he wasn't yet sure what form that action should take. Back at the farm, the reality of the blockade struck harder with each passing day. Deliveries that once came easily were now delayed or rerouted. He had to spend hours navigating difficult back paths to reach town, burning more fuel, wasting precious time, and exhausting himself further. His cattle trucks couldn't pass through the narrow trails, making routine farm business nearly impossible. The simple convenience of living had become a daily struggle, all because a few neighbors had decided their grievances outweighed his right to access. The emotional toll was heavier still. Each time he saw the fence, it felt like a personal attack, a reminder that his place in the community was no longer respected. Nights grew restless as he lay awake thinking of solutions, his mind spinning in circles between anger and despair. His quiet life, once defined by the steady rhythm of labor and rest, had been disrupted in a way that left him unsettled and raw. He tried once more to reason with the neighbors, approaching them calmly despite the storm brewing inside him. "This isn't just about me," he explained. "The road's been here for decades. It serves the farm, and without it, I can't survive." But the neighbors, standing with arms crossed and faces hard, dismissed him outright. "You'll figure something else out," one of them said coldly. "This isn't your road to use." Their words were final, spoken with the certainty of people who believed they held all the power. The farmer walked away that day with anger burning beneath his calm exterior. He realized then that negotiation would lead nowhere. They were not interested in compromise. They wanted control, and control, once taken, was rarely given back without a fight. Word of the blockade reached further across the community, dividing people into quiet camps. Some sympathized privately, offering kind words but no real support. Others avoided him altogether, unwilling to risk taking sides. A few even hinted that perhaps the neighbors were within their rights, fanning the flames of doubt. The farmer listened to it all in silence, but inside his resolve was hardening. One evening, he stood once more before the fence, staring at the cruel red letters declaring him unwelcome. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, and the air carried the weight of everything he stood to lose. He thought of his father, of how the man had built this farm with sweat and sacrifice, of how his mother had endured hardship with quiet dignity. This land was not just soil and wood, it was legacy, and he would not allow it to be caged by those who thought themselves above fairness. The blockade was more than a fence. It was a challenge. It dared him to give up, to surrender his independence, to bow to the will of others. But the farmer was not made for surrender. The road had been his lifeline, and now that it was cut, he felt a fire within him he hadn't felt in years. If they thought they had trapped him, they were wrong. They had only awakened a determination that ran deeper than fences or property lines. Though the days ahead promised struggle, perhaps even more hostility, he knew one thing with certainty. He would fight, not with fists or reckless anger, but with patience, intelligence, and the strength that came from knowing his cause was just. The blockade was a neighbor's move, but the game was far from over. And as he turned back toward his farmhouse, the fading light behind him, he carried within his heart the quiet beginning of a plan that would change everything. The farmer sat at his kitchen table that night with the lamplight flickering softly across the worn wood. His coffee had gone cold, but he hadn't touched it in hours. The image of the blockade across his road wouldn't leave his mind, and with every minute that passed, the weight of what it meant pressed harder on his chest. His farm was landlocked, strangled by the selfishness of his neighbors, and the only path he relied on for decades was suddenly stolen away. He thought about driving through the fence with his tractor, but he knew it would only escalate the conflict and give them more ammunition against him. No, he told himself, he would have to fight this another way. He needed justice, and he would seek it where justice was meant to be found, through the law. The next morning, the farmer dressed in his best work shirt, the one he usually reserved for Sunday gatherings or trips into town. He drove into the county office, a modest building with peeling paint and a faded American flag fluttering at the entrance. Inside, He explained the situation to a clerk at the desk, a young woman who looked at him with polite but distracted eyes. She listened as he spoke about the road, the fence, and his inability to access his own property. She took notes, handed him a form, and told him to fill it out for the county surveyor to review. It was a start, but it felt far too casual for the magnitude of the problem. Days turned into weeks as the farmer waited for a response. The surveyor eventually came, clipboard in hand, walking the path with him and shaking his head as if sympathizing. "This is a tough one," the man said. "Technically, the road's been used for decades, but it might not be officially recorded as an easement." That word, easement, stuck with the farmer. He had heard of it before, but never had reason to think it applied to him. Now, it was the difference between freedom and confinement. The surveyor promised to write up his report and send it to the county board, but even he hinted that the process could drag out. As the farmer waited, his frustration grew. He had livestock to tend, equipment that needed servicing, and supplies that he couldn't easily bring in because of the roadblock. Every trip into town required a long detour across rough fields, tearing up his soil and wasting valuable time. He felt the physical toll each day, but worse than that was the emotional one. Each time he passed by that blockade, the anger flared inside him like a fire he couldn't put out. He wondered how his neighbors could live with themselves, watching him suffer just for the sake of petty control. Determined not to give up, the farmer sought out a lawyer in town. The office was cramped and smelled faintly of old books, but the attorney, a middle-aged man with glasses slipping down his nose, seemed competent. The farmer laid out his case, showing maps and explaining the history of the road. The lawyer listened carefully, nodding here and there, and finally leaned back in his chair. "You may have a case," he said, "but it won't be easy. If there's no written easement, we'll have to argue for what's called prescriptive easement, basically proving that you've used that road openly and continuously for years. That takes time, witnesses, and sometimes even a court battle." The farmer sighed. He didn't want a court battle. He wanted his road back. But the lawyer assured him that it might be the only way. Legal letters were drafted and sent to the neighbors, demanding that the blockade be removed. The response came quickly, not from the neighbors themselves, but from their lawyer. The letter was cold, dismissive, and firm. The road was private, and the farmer had no right to it. Reading those words, the farmer felt the sting of betrayal all over again. These were people he had once shared meals with, exchanged favors with, even trusted. Now, they hid behind legal jargon while his livelihood suffered. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread through the community. Some townsfolk sympathized with the farmer, quietly offering words of encouragement when they saw him in the feed store or at church. Others avoided the subject entirely, fearful of taking sides in a dispute that was quickly becoming notorious. A few even suggested that the farmer was making too much of it, that maybe he should just find another way. Those words cut deeper than they realized. For them, it was easy to dismiss. For him, it was his life being disrupted. The farmer attended county meetings, standing up in a modest hall and making his case before local officials. He spoke clearly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This road has been here longer than any of us," he said. "It's not just dirt and gravel. It's my connection to the world. Without it, I'm trapped, and no neighbor has a right to take that away." Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The officials listened, but offered little beyond promises to look into it. Each day that passed without progress felt like a slow defeat. The farmer woke early, tended his animals, worked his fields, and went to bed with a knot in his stomach. The neighbors, on the other hand, seemed emboldened. They added more signs to the blockade, posting warnings of private property and no trespassing. IT was as if they were taunting him, daring him to cross the line. The farmer clenched his fists whenever he saw it, but forced himself to stay calm. If he lashed out even once, They would use it against him in court. Months dragged on, and the legal battle inched forward at a pace that felt unbearable. The lawyer filed motions, gathered affidavits, and prepared for hearings, but the system seemed designed to test his patience. The farmer often returned from town feeling as though the weight of the courthouse doors had followed him home, pressing on his shoulders. He had chosen to play by the rules, but the rules were slow, and the neighbors knew it. They reveled in the delay, living their lives as if nothing had changed, while he struggled to adapt. Despite his frustration, the farmer refused to give in. At night, he would sit on his porch, staring out at the stars above his land. The stillness of the night reminded him why he fought so hard. This was his home, his legacy, and no one, not even those who lived closest, had the right to strip it from him. He thought about his father, who had walked those same fields, and his grandfather, who had carved the farm from raw land. They hadn't given up in the face of hardship, and neither would he. The fight for justice was not just about a road anymore. It had become a test of his endurance, his values, and his belief in fairness. He wanted the law to stand for something, to prove that the system worked even for a simple farmer against stubborn neighbors. And though the waiting wore him down, it also hardened his resolve. Each setback was fuel for his determination. Each dismissal from an official only deepened his promise to himself. He would not back down. By the end of that long, grueling year, the farmer had learned more about the legal system than he ever cared to know. He had spent hours in courtrooms, sat through endless meetings, and read documents filled with words that blurred together. But through it all, one truth became clear. He was fighting an uphill battle, and justice, if it came, would be slow. Still, he held on to hope, because hope was all he had left to keep him going.